to the One Dime Podcast. I'm here with Ed from the New Conversation podcast and YouTube channel.
Hey there.
And we were discussing some Marxist concepts such as materialism versus idealism, and more specifically later on, structural Marxism and instrumental Marxism. And this is part of a follow-up to a video on the One Dime channel, which I made and uploaded as of today, as you are hearing this, called Why Billionaires Vote Democrat. An admittedly clickbait title, but the purpose of it was really to counter the notion that politics is just dictated by a battle of ideas and that things can be solved by getting the right people in power. In that video, I felt I kind of misrepresented some of Ralph Miliband, the so-called instrumental Marxist, as at the time I mainly read up on the structural Marxists like Althusser and Polantzis, but not so much of Miliband himself. But upon looking deeper, there are some certain things regarding the representation of his ideas I feel compelled to correct. But before going into that, you got to assume that a lot of people don't know the basic concepts of Marxist theory. And the most important theme of the video that I tried to explain, which I think is universally applicable and understandable, is idealism versus materialism, and how it pertains to viewing political history, and more specifically, when it comes to the video, the Democratic Party and the United States. So Ed, why don't you give a brief introduction to yourself, what your channel is about, as well as what you see the difference between idealism and materialism as being?
Sure thing. Okay, I guess a new conversation is undergoing a bit of a relaunch. We've just started a fortnightly podcast release on Spotify that coincides with whatever new material we've got going on YouTube. I think we take two sort of strands to left-wing politics, which is sort of combating alt-right rhetoric, which is the topic of our next series coming sometime next year, soon, I hope, and then more sort of positively political education in terms of sort of Marxism and socialism, which will be the topic of our third series later on in the year. Really looking forward to getting back to it. I think myself and Ollie's the other guy from the channel. We've been sort of heavily disrupted from this year's events, so we're looking forward to getting back on the track.
For those who haven't heard it, I went on one of Ed's podcasts on his channel, which you can check out. I shared it on my community page, so you can find it there. It was an interesting episode where we discussed some of Marxism, but a bit of postmodernism as well.
Absolutely, and I think we're hoping in the new year to follow that up with something on accelerationism, imperialism, barbarism, and what will hopefully be our alternatives.
Sure.
January, you down with that?
Yeah, that'll be a very interesting episode. As accelerationism is not something there's a lot of very fruitful discourse on. A lot of people use the term without knowing it, but that's not what we're really here for today. We kind of want to open with discussing the notions of materialism and idealism. Materialism being a core aspect of Marxism. For those who are really new, materialism is not used in the sense of materialistic, like buying things, but rather seeing material conditions as being more important to the evolution of history and politics than abstract ideas, which is very opposite to the way we are commonly taught, which is the liberal way of thinking, which is idealism. The idea, which goes very hand in hand with great man theory, the idea that we have different ideas, these ideas progress over time or just change, and these change society, whereas it would be the opposite in a Marxian lens, whereas the material conditions produce ideas, and these ideas also are used to rationalize the conditions that already exist. But there's a lot more nuance to this, and the way I see materialism is ground up, whereas idealism is top down. Materialism is, in this regard, actually more scientific. I have a little gripes with the idea that Marxism is a science, or that any real social science is a science. But there's a reason why you'll hear Marxists claim that their field of study is scientific. And Marx and Engels, when they were writing, they weren't the first to write about socialism. There were various socialists, such as Owen, Charles Fourier, and I always forget his name, another English lad. But there are other socialists before, and also Rousseau kind of he didn't call himself a socialist, but like a sort of utopian liberal. And when Marx and Engels, they called these thinkers who were very left wing for their time, they called them utopian socialists, mainly because they only discussed the ideas of what better societies would be, but less about how politics actually changes and how it can change. And in contrast to that, they called themselves scientific socialists. And what that means is the scientific aspect is just that they look at actual objective conditions. You see, like the liberal notion, which is idealism, is they look at things kind of in terms of these great thinkers. They had these ideas, they influenced people, and this is how society happened. Like let's take the American Revolution, but actually that's more complicated, but let's take neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is easier because like most people know the general history of that.
Yeah.
Is a way a liberal, or even you see left people who have this idealist lens, which I'm attempting to argue against, they'll see neoliberalism as people like starting with Friedrich von Hayek, Friedrich von Mises of the Austrian school, having these conservative economic ideas, which later influenced the Chicago school under people like Milton Friedman. The guy famous for saying greed is good.
For sure.
These people had these ideas. They influenced people in government. And this became the idea in which they wanted to test an idea of neoliberalism, that you would deregulate, cut taxes, and that this, by cutting taxes, deregulating industry, privatizing many industries, you would widen the wealth gap temporarily, according to them, but you would create so much wealth that it would trickle down. And the way this is presented is because we know for factually that did not pan out at all. Like working class wages overall have been stagnant, and in the case of the United States, actually going down. Buying power has gone down, whereas the inequality, CEO salary for the rich, overall wealth for the top 1% gone up dramatically. But the way a materialist would see this is very different from the way a liberal idealist. A liberal idealist would see this as a failure of ideas. These ideas influenced and they were bad. Whereas a materialist would just see that really this was just class war and the rich won. The rich were the only one who waged the class war and they won. And these policies were just precisely intended to have such an effect. So nothing failed. And I indicate that in my video.
But, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's certainly what I was getting at. I think you've got, I would say that some of the, you put in a lot there, some of the aspects would need a little unpacking, but I'm trying to sort of go with the core one. I mean, if you think about von Mises and Hayek, the Montpellier Society, coming up just over 100 years ago now, no, just under, sorry, and they're getting together, and it is pure idealism. They're putting their ideas together, but it's because of a real threat to the material conditions, with sort of, they were a reaction to the likes of communism at the time, and
that's Hayek's main book's basically all about. Against the USSR type of economics.
But the interplay between idealism and materialism, which that instance sort of illustrates. I mean, it's only the thread of material change, but they put in place before, so that's say the 30s up to the 70s. They're putting material resources. They're backing their idealism with material resources, building infrastructure and think tanks and avenues, circuits, social networks in the classical sense to sort of to run their idea along. So I mean, I think if you look at the 20th century, you've got a battle of you got that big battle, that big ideological battle between communism and capitalism across the world, and this thread is running along the circuits that their material power has put in place, and it emerges at the point of opportunity with the likes of Thatcher and Reagan. But
yeah, the think tanks are very important to mention, because it's not like the materialist lens, Marxist lens, disregard ideology. Like, obviously ideology is crucial and ideas are important, but these ideas come from a material base and used to justify and maintain or bring forth a certain material base, which is like a set of class relations. Like in the case of von Mises, Hayek, the Mont Pelerin Institute, they were also seeing they did not want these people were very privileged, come from very bourgeois families. They did not want even the possibility of some kind of socialism to be implemented. They already disliked Keynesianism, because despite Keynesianism really actually saving capitalism, as I mentioned in the video, and you can just see it's factually, like throughout history, is that capitalism in Britain and US, first in America, were just in shambles, and Keynesianism essentially is what revived it. And but at the time, Keynesianism was, when the Mont Pelerin Institute was still original, like in its infancy, when they were first starting to have, like, the Austrian school was really active. Their ideas weren't actually taken seriously, and that's because the Keynesian order was already they were already like doing very well. There was no need for a change. There was a boom, absolute economic boom. Even though the working and middle classes were getting a bigger slice of the pie than they do now, the ultimate winners were the rich. They're getting actually wealthier. But when the 1970s inflation started to occur, first stagnant growth, that was the first part. And what's interesting, it's not like an economic collapse like 1920. It's important for people to know that capitalism has these kind of like crashes if it just as simply doesn't keep growing exponentially. And that was the case in the 70s. It's not like there was a drastic collapse.
What capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely not. Like, it was just that growth wasn't as high as it was before, and that's a problem for capitalism. It always has to be higher. And to add icing on the cake was really OPEC, the tumbling of the problem with gas prices, which people blamed on Jimmy Carter. Inflation was a problem, more so for people who had a lot of savings, because that's when it made a bigger income. It wasn't Weimar Republic. Like, it wasn't where people with wheelbarrows, but a very small inflation rate, or even a moderate inflation rate, is still enough for really a bourgeois class to be angry about, because it's really their wealth is going down. And there's many ideas proposed at this time. There were still like a new form of like a neo-Keynesianism, which sort of Nixon was a proponent of, which was a UBI, and actually to facilitate consumer spending. That was actually an option at the time. But the other options at the time were this resurging Austrian economics in the form of Chicago school economics, which was really just more radically right version of the Mont Pelerin Institute, which is Austrian economics. And this is like, the greed is good. But the reason why this was chosen, it's not just because these ideas were better and decided in an abstract, marketplace of ideas that they were better than the neo-Keynesianism or Marxism, for that matter. It was more so that these think tanks, as you mentioned, had a lot of influence, and that comes from material resources to influence academia, to influence government institutions, and also simply because it was just the easiest way to appease the upper classes and restore capital. Like, what better way can you do than just privatizing industry and lowering taxes and deregulating? It's a very easy way to just...
Absolutely. And I think that entire sort of schema there exemplifies the sort of the limits of idealism. You've got your fluctuating basically a century of sort of politics, governments coming in and out with their different policies and different ideas, and on that level, you've got contingency and it had real material impacts, obviously, because you have a recently enfranchised working class to an extent starting to sort of lose that franchise, lose their grip on or their sort of their foothold in their access to wealth, because based on the ideas coming in and out. But what I mean by the limits of it is that despite the sort of the ins and outs, nothing fundamentally changed. These ideas were still, from the 20s and 30s, were still able to re-emerge not 70 years later, but 50 years later, to impact, to just exactly as you described, to sort of bring capitalism back in place. And the reason that sort of capitalism was off kilter as such, or actually, it wasn't, because as you said there, Keynesianism was a sort of a more healthy in terms of capitalism in the long run, because it kept it in check. But the reason,
but there's limits to it, right? It doesn't always work.
Oh no, of
because
course.
There is truth to the inflation aspect, but it was not as drastic as people say. But in general, like, it was something that people were starting to get fed up. Like, there was a growing sentiment among the bourgeois class that, like, these government regulations were getting in the way. There was, why can't we just, things would just be so much simpler if we didn't have all these regulations, all these taxes. And a lot of people didn't pay their taxes, but they would have to, go through a lot of loopholes. More loopholes than they have now.
What I'm getting at there, though, is that why then, and why that moment, and how come the ideas that up until then in the post-war period were the ones that were there? And so despite not changing things fundamentally in material terms, the reasons that I suppose there was a gap between the moment that neoliberalism was conceived and its arrival to the political scene was material conditions.
That's important for sure. The Soviet Union kind of crumbling, that's another big factor, right?
At that point, well, I mean, I think that sort of
that helped it along. I would say, like, the Soviet Union really started crumbling under Brezhnev.
Oh, that's
like,
fair.
Yeah, that was like in the 70s. It didn't, like, because it wasn't so simple. Like, when the Soviet Union fell, that was when neoliberalism became not just like an emerging political system, and it became the global consensus.
Yeah.
But it was like a thing it was a process. Like, as you were saying, that the working class, I like to say labor, because the labor, it's really complicated, because there's people who are classified as middle class now who are actually have less buying power than, like, they had the same buying power as, like, working class did 50 years ago. So, but like labor, I have to use the term labor, because labor totally lost its power, and there's a lot of reasons for this. I think it's good to go domestically first, because the post-war consensus of Keynesianism and unionism, which was certainly more radical in England and France than it was in America. Like, that's important to say, is that the social democracy under America was actually very modest. They didn't even have free healthcare, whereas England did. And there was a larger presence of worker cooperatives under Clement Attlee's social democracy. But the thing is about this post-war consensus, it wasn't exactly like that pretty. It was notoriously very bureaucratic, because these unions, which the reactionaries often used to weaponize against labor, but they weren't entirely wrong in saying that a lot of these union members were part of the state and also kind of part of a certain, like, petite bourgeois class, and they would often prioritize their needs over the workers. And there was a lot of mafia ties with unions. There was it was not exactly a great consensus. Of course, it's understandable why the rich hated it. It was a necessary hurdle to their wealth, but it wasn't like ideal. Let's just say, like, it wasn't what the labor they wanted more. And it was something there was a lot of problems with the post-war consensus, and it, let's just say, it lost its steam over time. And yeah, is there something you want to
Well,
add to that
I
before
would,
going to
yeah,
the
yeah, for sure.
Soviets?
I would think that the so this losing steam and the growing accumulation of like sort of grievances that, but on both sides, that sort of led to the social democratic moment coming to an end. I think the material underpinnings that, and because it's only a slight and an idealistic change in society rather than a fundamental material one, the underpinning material conditions aren't enormous, but they're significant in terms of those changes, and they are the stock of labor in the post-war period, immediately after the wars, of course. I mean, and the capital stock. And so these two factors and the relationship between them are the sort of like, you know, the building blocks of materialism. And what I mean is that because the stock of labor as a commodity, or as the units that bring labor as a commodity to the workforce or to the marketplace, that stock of labor was depleted. And in terms, you know, in a free market, supply and demand determines the price. Labor was more scarce, less abundant, and its cost went up. Capital was also invested, or had been invested into imperialist endeavors, and it wasn't, you know, as sort of I mean, it was there, but it wasn't as liquid. And so the relationship between labor and capital here, there's a moment of leverage that labor didn't have. Of course, there was a few decades that were really building up before the war period, you know, that led to the Russian Revolution and everything. There was a lot of agitation in Europe and the US, and I don't know what was happening in Canada at the
And
time.
also, I would say, like, after 68, there was kind of after the protests of 1968 to 1969 sort of lost their momentum in France and England and Germany and United States. There was sort of a fade in optimism in labor movement in general. Like, a lot of people retreated from politics. That was a big problem. Like, the voter turnouts, I believe, actually decreased quite a bit. And there was kind of a lot of people just lost hope in general. And the thing is looking at through like a class struggle instead of a idealist lens, is that, you know, all the things we do get from a capitalist society, like the labor rights we do have, the programs we do get, that's only because that's when the state feels they have to have those things in order to preserve labor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Because like the capitalist system cannot continue without labor. They need the workers. Like, that's something that we often are taught the opposite from a neoliberal narrative, that if we tax the corporations, they'll run away. But in reality, these corporations, all capitalists, they cannot function without the laborer. And the state, which is like, as I discussed in the video, is like the mediator between the capitalist and the worker. It reconciles class interests. It will do so when it has to. So if people aren't really giving a fuck and there isn't like a lot of protests, a lot of demands, the state can get away with more pro-capital policies. And it's not just, obviously, as we were talking, like Reagan and Thatcher is what ushered in like a neoliberal revolution, but the crumbling of the welfare state started before that. And really, like, monetary policy, the shift to that started under Jimmy Carter. I believe Jimmy Carter started the first set of deregulatory reforms. And even JF Kennedy, as I mentioned, JF Kennedy actually had one of the first dramatic lowering of tax rates. He lowered the marginal top tax rate from 91 to 65%.
Oh, 91.
No one ever paid that, but like, I mean, it was still like dramatic. Like it started before, and that's the thing, is these, like, I have issue with people who think that, like, you know, we can just have social democracy, like,
for sure.
It denies that how volatile these social democratic reforms are, and also, as we were saying, like, these things don't even get implemented without a very active working class radical movement.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's so underlying all of that is, I mean, what do you have before the war? And like an absolute abundance of labor that capital, with its liquid capital, doesn't need to pay attention to other than keeping it from revolting, because obviously there's a lot. But the issue with a lot of labor, you're never going to have, or hopefully someday we will, but in that situation, that historic situation, labor wasn't in a position to have, the 250 million Indian strikers there last week. You're not going to have the labor force in absolute totality leave its station. There's all the capitalists account for like the absolute deprived to step in. That doesn't that issue becomes far less when labor is far more scarce.
100%.
And over time then, from the 50s across the 60s, what's happening there is an accumulation of the labor stock, the boomer generation. They're booming. And the more they boom, the less valuable they become. And of course, the healthy Keynesian capitalism is generating that delicious surplus value, the other material element. And
that's a good point too, because like when there's the less valuable labor becomes, basically the more capital can get away with neglecting labor interests. Whereas when labor has more leverage, naturally, of course, they can't get away with giving less rights or having lower wages.
And I guess come so those as you just said it there, with starting with JFK, those conditions are beginning to crumble as both capital is being accumulated and labor stock is increasing and thus devaluing. And you've already got at that stage the point, and both of which have only continued, and to our current situation today, where the fluctuating scene in terms of ideology, in terms of idealism, and in terms of the ideas being put into practice have only attenuated themselves in terms of those material underpinnings, only to very slight degrees, because nothing fundamentally has changed. Capital took a rest because it was weak, and now it's it's booming again.
I think I just thought of another really good example as to why it's not like a matter of ideas being implemented and just simply really just choosing an ideology that rationalizes a redistribution of wealth to a certain class. And like, if you analyze Milton Friedman, who's of course the poster boy of neoliberal economics, his ideas are actually, I don't want to even use the word progressive, but they were more progressive compared to what was actually implemented. For instance, like while he was in favor of mass deregulation, cutting of the welfare state, a flat tax, but he was actually in favor of a UBI because he believed a UBI could be like a replicant to the welfare system. And also he was thinking in terms of capital as a way to foster consumer spending. But at the time, this wasn't implemented. Why wasn't it? If they were really subscribing to a neoliberal doctrine that was following the Chicago School ideas, why didn't they have UBI as well? Well, I would say simply just because they didn't have to. If they can get away with not giving people that, they won't. They just won't do it. If people aren't demanding it and they aren't posing a serious threat to the system, they're not gonna get that UBI. What they ended up doing to solve the consumer spending problem is, instead of giving people money, they just had loosened up credit laws so that banks could basically give people loans that people would never be able to pay back, and the banks would get paid by the government anyway. And a person who's an idealist, they would think, oh, but isn't like UBI is just smarter and it works better? Yeah, but like that's policy isn't made off of this rational marketplace or anything. It's really, when you give something like UBI, you do in the point of view of like the bourgeois state and the bourgeois class, you do pose a risk of letting the working class know of what it's capable of getting. And that's like that's a materialist lens. This may seem common sense in the way we're discussing it right now, but in the overarching mainstream thought, which is idealist fundamentally, and it pervades academia still, is like it is kind of that's not what you hear so much. You more so hear that these ideas were just wrong, they were bad, they're failed, and we need new ideas. And that's why at the start I mentioned Robert Reich, because Robert Reich, in my opinion, is or Robert Reich, if you pronounce it that way, he's the really short economist who has a documentary on Netflix called Saving Capitalism.
Okay.
Or there's also Joseph Stiglitz. He's another example.
Yeah,
or Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty is more progressive, but they all kind of are having these. They're basically just proposing a new neo-Keynesianism.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what's funny is that Robert Reich actually tried to influence the Clinton administration's policy, and so did Joseph Stiglitz. And they ended up writing books about saying like they didn't take my advice and this is so much better. And you'd think like, oh, these people aren't idiots, like these people are very well educated. It's just, it shows you that their disconnect from the reality is just simply the fact that they're coming from a idealist lens. They think that the ideas are actually what is at stake here, whereas it's more just a matter of class war, and the working class is fundamentally way behind.
For sure. I think there's two important sort of bookends to that. Is we could look at the whole discourse over, in the left to get Biden in, but also the actual history of the capitalist left and Parliament itself.
The capitalist left. I like it.
Is that not exactly who you described?
Well, I just call it like liberalism, embedded liberalism.
Yeah, liberal, center, left. So
but it's funny.
The capitalist left,
because most of the left is capitalist, and people don't want to acknowledge that, but it's unfortunate.
Oh, that's the limits of idealism, because without engaging the material situation, you are proposing a reform, an idea, a piecemeal pushing Biden to the left. You are sort of only pushing it that.
That's a good segue, actually.
Well, before you get into it, that you can't. It imbues itself in so many respects to the sort of the I don't know. I was going to say grassroots left, but it's not that. It's not that rosy. The online left. And
it's true.
all the sort of the conflict and the arguments between them does sort of amount to whoever will get called a tanky for saying you basically, they're saying you're not engaging the material conditions, say of any given identity politics. It's like if you're not engaging the material conditions that underpin the sort of the power and the social franchise of someone who's black or someone who's transsexual, how do you propose to better the situation? And often the response is, well, through these ideas, like an enhanced human right.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because anyone who's listening to this, just to clarify that we aren't a bunch of class reductionists or whatever, is that really okay, a good example is intersectionality doesn't necessarily have to be idealist, even though in its implementation it often is. And that's because if you look at it in terms of actually the fact that there are different struggles between Black people, Hispanic people, indigenous people, there's different struggles, and this is rooted in materialism. There's a difference in their material reality that needs to be accounted for, and that is not antithetical to Marxism. It's complementary to it, and that there's a reason why a lot of the most prominent Black activists, such as the Black Panthers, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, are Marxists, including Malcolm X, Marxist, also Martin Luther King, Marxist. Although he didn't overtly call a label, but he called himself a democratic socialist and used a lot of Marxian concepts like wage slavery and exploitation and the like. But yeah, to clarify, is that's an example, right? Is intersectionality when it comes to accounting for different struggles, material realities, that is in line with Marxism. But in terms of the liberal identity politics, which is essentialism, Professor Adolf Reed does a good job of distinguishing these things, is Essentialism is the idea that there is something fundamentally different in the ideas and the essence of a black person, a woman, a trans person, and thus the solution, which is often the case with liberal governments, is to have more black people in power, more women as CEOs, stuff like that. And obviously, this doesn't change anything of the struggle of the structures that lead to racial and economic exploitation and oppression. And that's the disconnect, right? I don't want to get too off the end of it here, but I think there's a good quote is that Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a philosopher heavily influenced by Marxism, has a quote: "Existence precedes essence," and that's like the best way to sum it up. Is that rather than this abstract picture of the human that is autonomous from their material condition and that their ideas influence these conditions, it's rather that these conditions influence the human, and these ideas are products of those conditions. And that's like a way to think about it.
Absolutely, yeah. Did you want to go with your segue there, or?
Oh yeah, like you said, pushing Biden to the left. You were talking about how the kind of delusion some people have that, oh, why don't we just push Biden to the left?
But before that, because I said bookends, I think before getting into that, and that would be perfect. Just a quick the other side of that bookend is to sort of to qualify the left wing capitalists. Is you've got a situation in Parliament with where Parliament is derived and where the very idea of the left wing derives from is like the French Parliament. Those who sat on the left side of that Parliament were in favor of improving workers' conditions, but they were capitalists.
Yeah, and I mean, that's so important because there's actually many prominent capitalists who are very, one might think progressive, but like I don't think progressive doesn't necessarily mean like socialist or even like solving the problem.
Oh man, but progress is mowing down the Amazon to grow cattle. For McDonald's.
I mean, the genocide of
development
indigenous people was progress for the liberals who are all about their liberty. So,
but yeah, it's development, isn't it?
Well, that's perfect example, right? If you look at the Constitution, is or you hear about people like Locke, John Locke, who are liberal idealists and believe in these abstract notions of liberty, equality, fraternity, and stuff like that. But like you see, it's not in practice at all. Like these people are proponents of slavery up till the very end, and yeah, like you got to look at like the conditions. Like the ideas are merely just rationalizations or products of it, or ways to understand it. They're not the end all be all of the reality.
I think you mentioned either before, I can't remember, was it before we start hit record or not, but they might not necessarily be aware of that. It's just the limitations of that philosophy, of that view, the one that they've adopted, maybe not even critically. So like from that moment, from Locke through the left wing and right wing of early parliamentary politics, all the way up to what we're about to get into now with Biden, you like that this idea of well-meaning liberal progressivism is just the limit of it. And I said again, perhaps uncritically, is that it deals in ideas and doesn't seek to engage with the sort of material requirements needed to transcend capitalism, basically, because they don't see the reason why, because they're dealing with idealism.
You know who I think is a perfect example of what you just said? So the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, or many of these thought leaders in the commentary space, like I would say even Jimmy Dore is guilty of this. Crystal Ball, who I consider, to be honest, a charlatan, but that's for another day, is
I've honestly not watched either of those three names, but I do know.
You're not missing anything.
I have a sense of what you're talking about. All right.
Yeah, like you said, they kind of say we need to push Biden to the left, and this is sort of, I see this resurging to an extent, saying, oh, why can't AOC just push the Democrats to the left and implement Medicare for all? And it's like, that's not how this works. It's not like you have debates in parliament about the best ideas. Like, I don't know if people actually ever watched a debate in the Congress or the parliament or the Senate. It's not, there's a very, very tiny window of what is even acceptable.
If
you
the
see,
Koch brothers, just on AOC, if the Koch brothers sank their and Bezos and whoever sank their entire fortune into the US state going to war with China, which resulted in the depletion of half the population of the planet, then AOC would be in a position to put in Medicare because Labour would have leverage and the capitalists wouldn't have liquid funds.
Well, that's assuming that that sounds very.
I'm being incredibly flippant.
I know, of course, but I was about to say that sounds like Poseidism. Like that there needs to be a nuclear.
Is that in a segue as well? Can we?
No, let's not talk about Poseidism is no, but yeah, that's like. No, but like what you're joking about, but there is like the point is okay, like there's a material reality, but also how people react to that. So yeah, of course. Things have been shit for a very long time, but it's just there isn't like an organized left movement to really deal with that and to demand anything. Like there needs to be serious demands that are organized. Also needs to be left people in positions of power, and I mean a lot. Like you're not going to solve it by having like the squad because they're outnumbered. They're fundamentally outnumbered. Like, and even once you get in power, it doesn't stop there, as we see with Jeremy Corbyn. Like Jeremy Corbyn got, I would say, like, you know, it's impressive already that he was able to win in the Labour Party. Yeah, but you see how they find ways to undo that. But the point is with pushing Biden to the left. I see this sentiment also with the Young Turks and the way they always talk about the Democrats. They number one, they say the corporate Democrats as if there were ever not corporate Democrats. And they always say the Democrats they just don't get it. They're idiots. And they always talk about people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, like they're just some sort of morons who don't understand anything. And it's like, you know, these people's net worth is like in the hundreds of millions. They're well aware, like, well, maybe they're not, but like the point is that
they should.
They're not. They're acting in their class interests.
Yeah.
And they're also doing as much as they have to. Pelosi, okay, if she knows she can still win without, you know, let's just say giving a UBI or a Medicare for all. Okay, I actually think UBI is more doable than Medicare for all. But like she's not going to do any of those things unless she's threatened. Literally. That's as simple as it gets. You're not going to convince them. AOC is not going to save the day. So, and this is an important way of viewing things because then people will say, oh, is it just hopeless? Well, no, you actually need, like, people need to be on the streets. There needs to be like, you see what like India just did. Like that's an example, in my opinion, of like what the left should be going towards is like a mass strike like that. That's like resistance. Resistance isn't electing for Congress.
No, and that's the thing. That's like the idea that I'd love to sort of. I just want everyone who sort of towed that line like let's push Biden left to ask themselves, how do they know they've not been pushed right just by saying that? Because
the Democrats did get pushed to the right, and that's really just
on the ground. I mean, you know, not the Democrats on the ground, but yeah, absolutely, you're right there. But people just on the ground saying that, like, just ask themselves, wait a minute, have I been pushed right by saying this? Because there's a world of difference of that strategy and what's happening in India.
Yeah, absolutely, and I mean, Trump, like, let's say if Trump, people like, I know, like, I'm very obviously like ultra critical and not optimistic about the Democrats whatsoever. I think there needs to be, I don't even think I go as far as I don't even think like you could win within the Democratic Party. I think there needs to be a new party. Fundamentally, that's the most important thing. But that said, I'm not deluded that somehow it would be the same under a Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is able to get away with even more awful things than the Democrats. And that's because the people who vote for Donald Trump, in the case of Democrats, people often do so reluctantly just to get out the Republicans, or they kind of are compromising, or they are deluded into thinking they are doing being more progressive. But in the case of Trump, people are much more aware of what they're, well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but people who are voting for Trump aren't like, they're not they don't want socialism. At least they think they don't want socialism. They're getting what they want. They want law and order. And as a result, Trump, he can get away with doing nothing and actually, bringing out the military just to stomp out a very, very, not, in my opinion, not a very threatening protest, which was Black Lives Matter. And yeah, it's fundamentally worse. And he pushes discourse to the right. And as a result, Democrats get pushed to the right. It's not like, it's not the same. Just when I say like, there's a dictatorship of the capitalist class. Yes, but that doesn't mean that the two parties are the same. Their rhetoric are
for sure
different, for sure.
I think the difference is in terms of like the what to do now question isn't enormous. It's rhetorically significant. You go, well, let's push Biden right. Or you can go, okay, we've just given the left ourselves a chance not to be, black sacked and dragged away by militia because the most powerful and vocal and seen seat on the planet isn't dog whistling, neo-Nazis. So we've given ourselves an opportunity. We've given ourselves a bit more space than we might otherwise have to organize.
Yeah, for sure.
And to start working towards something like India.
Yeah. And what I think is another good segue is you're talking about the left capitalists. I like that term. I think it's Mark Fisher.
It's an important distinction.
He uses the term liberal communists. I really like that term. And he talks about people like George Soros and Bill Gates. And it's a joke, obviously, like they're not communists, very anti-communist, in fact. But these people,
they live that sweet freedom.
Well, yeah, we already live in communism for the rich. That's the irony. Yeah. They get $1 trillion bailouts. They like people who are skeptical of UBI like really need to be aware that these Apple actually operates on it. Apple got $1 billion subsidies. Apple got UBI, the biggest company in the world by market share, got government handouts.
Their office is in Ireland, and we're this not quite a tax haven, but we've got the lowest corporate tax in the EU. And
I've heard about that. Yeah, they're
so they all come and set up in Dublin. Yeah, but
Canada is too actually.
Apple owed Ireland 15 billion in tax, and the EU. I'm sorry, I forgot that wrong, but I think that's the amount. And the EU demanded that they pay it, and Ireland refused it.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So they'll probably say like, oh, their jobs are going to go away.
Jobs, my ass.
The irony, it's like, you could literally you could end homelessness and give everybody UBI with them.
Yep, exactly.
That's mental.
Sick. And there's only 4 or 5 million people on the island. You know what I mean? Like 15 billion.
Yeah,
man.
But when it comes to a liberal or left capitalist, it is important to talk about that because it's like, all billionaires don't have the same, or all bourgeois don't have the same ideology. They don't have all the same interests. Well, it is like capital interests, yes, but they have different approaches.
They're competing interests.
Yeah, that's competing capital, absolutely. But like, what's very important is that I would say, a lot of capitalists are smarter than others because they're looking for the long term. And one thing is I've seen more recently is capitalism has been more aggressive with the pandemic, the fact that the response has been so terrible. You've seen some billionaires like, in the case of Bill Gates, it's no surprise, but ones that I can think of that are most surprisingly is Warren Buffett and Ray Dalio, the billionaire investor. They've been talking about class war actually being the biggest threat to the downfall of America. It's really interesting. They use the word class war. And I mean, I wish they were right because class consciousness doesn't seem all that great yet. But
do they mean in potential? Like
potential, yeah, I'm sure.
To arise, yeah. I don't know.
That was
they prefer Trump.
Well, no, they prefer the Democrats.
No, I mean to Sanders.
Oh, well, I think they prefer anybody to Sanders.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, for sure. Sanders is a big difference from like, he's not, because Sanders is not just like social democracy in the like historical sense, in the sense that Bernie Sanders is like a radical social democracy with the goal of going to socialism.
I think he could perform the alternative, the performance as Trump in terms of dog whistling the right, dog whistling the left instead. If he was in power.
Well, yeah, I think, it was one of the, I mean,
that would have been his potential.
Yeah.
Or his legacy.
Absolutely.
not so much policies. But yeah, of course that. So yeah, that just the
Like,
point that they would prefer to keep someone like Trump, and even worse, in power over socialism, because class war fundamentally is the thing that engages with materialism and material
yes.
change, and anything and everything else is sort of
Now that was the important thing I showed their like little clip in the video, is because they are always like, Warren Buffett openly claims to be a Democrat. If you look at the where I didn't mention Mark Zuckerberg because he's said he's nonpartisan, but all his money actually goes to Democrats in terms of who he funds. It's overwhelmingly Democrats. Uh, and Charlie Munger, the other guy there he's also like a Democrat. Jeff Bezos also celebrated Biden's win. He said it was like unity in America. And
no,
like,
I'd go on. Sorry.
But yeah, it's look, these people prefer a Democrat because Democrats do give more stability, and they appease people like the lower classes more so than a Trump will, which Trump can bring like all this instability, and same with Bush. However, you see the extent of their supposed liberalism or left progressivism being very, limiting as soon as you see a figure like Bernie Sanders propose a wealth tax.
Absolutely,
like, no.
And I don't think the sort of the Democratic voting billionaires are smarter than the Republican ones so much. It's that I think there's a sort of the conservatism is might not need growth. Like someone like Bezos is young, Gates as well, relatively. They're not in their 70s, are they? I don't think so. And there's still a lot of the game to play. And there's still a lot of like the dawn of empire, if you know what I mean. There's still a lot of the market, their companies and their endeavors.
Well, they're afraid of that. They're afraid of the empire going down, and that's precisely what
exactly.
They say. It's like that's why they say like you need to give people something. You need to like give the breadcrumbs.
Yeah. Well, you need growth. But my point
that's
is
true. You can't have growth with a poor population. That's another factor. It's like you need like the middle class, which has been disintegrating in practically most of Western democracies, with a few exceptions. You can't like, who's going to buy from these companies if there's not enough money?
Exactly. And my point is though that in terms of like intelligence as such, but I'm sort of alluding to more different strategies that are at play, that the conservative element of the billionaire and the Republican and the Tory voters are perhaps have less of a stake in growing markets because possibly like, a lack of energy in terms of playing that empire game, because like in where an economy is growing quickly, things fluctuate quite rapidly and out of control, and so slower growth regimes mean more stable. Like I know what you mean. It's a different stability.
I wouldn't really argue that. And now the reason why I would say it is because like I think I showed a chart, but like it's hard to measure because these things change and are a bit difficult. But most of the amount of billionaires who claim to vote Democrat and Republican is actually quite divided, slightly more still Republican. But you see like the upper billionaires tend to be overwhelmingly Democrat. And
but hang on, like what sort of
when I say that, is they usually give to both parties. Like most overall, like capitalists, they give to both because just so they prevent any legislation that would possibly harm them. But it makes sense why overall, most rich people, and that is like statistically a fact, do prefer Republicans, give more to Republicans. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is, and I say rich people, 1 million plus, and that's, generally you have to be in a capitalist class to get in the upper millions. You have to own capital. And the reason why is because of the short-term interests, is that with Republicans, you do get more short-term. They are for more aggressive deregulations, bigger tax cuts. Like Trump had a gigantic 25% tax cut, I believe, in his administration.
Yeah, but the risk is
good for the COs.
The risk is minimized. Do you know what I mean? Like
the Democrats?
No. With in terms of economic investment and stuff. So like with tax breaks and privatization and anything you can squeeze out of the remnants of the welfare system, you're just getting profits as such. You're not investing money in a growing and healthy economy. and getting surplus value from that.
Well, that's the difference between the short-term, long-term interest, right? Is like the ones who go Democrat are looking for the long-term interest. And seemingly that's why, like, when I say intelligence, I didn't mean like the billionaires. Like, I don't really believe in like objective form of intelligence, but like I just mean that they're
the smart game and the dumb game.
Yeah, they're thinking ahead, because like some of these billionaires, like, you know, like they are like, the more I looked when I was doing research for this video, is like some of them are like surprisingly very, very, very well aware of things. Like in like, for example, there was actually an interview, an older written interview with Warren Buffett, and there's a guy on Reddit who posted it, if I can find it. But basically, Warren Buffett said he had read Das Kapital and it drastically changed how he views like political economy and stuff like that. And what he said, why? It was because he's aware that markets aren't rational. And that's different from like a neoliberal dogma, which thinks that everything is rational.
Yeah, but that's ideology.
Well, it's all, yeah, it's total ideology, of course. But that's the thing, is like you see a lot of, that is like the ideology that infiltrates most of the bourgeois class and just in general.
In terms of like hardwired, like they believe it, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. But you see like some of these, you know, people like Buffett, and also you see George Soros, they're aware of like how broken the system is.
Yeah.
And kind of, they're not trying to, here's the thing, they don't think billionaires shouldn't exist. They don't, they're not really fundamentally doing anything to prevent the situation that got them there, but they are, for like, to an extent, making things more fair, regulated, balanced, so that
they're trying to make it
they don't want the 1929 to happen again, basically.
But so I suppose I wasn't saying like in terms of actual intelligence either. Just the short game isn't as irrational as it sort of seems either. Like oh
no, yeah, they're both different kind of interests. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's actually some really interesting election history. Is that so? For most of U.S. history, overwhelmingly Republicans got more donations, campaign donations, than the Democrats. But this changed under Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton drastically took a lot of Wall Street money. And then essentially by that moment, like by that time, both the Democrats, Republicans were getting a lot. Bush ended up winning afterwards. Obama actually got more Wall Street funding than John McCain did, more billionaire funding overall. But actually in the second election, when he was against Mitt Romney slightly got more billionaires than Obama did. And it's a little bit interesting, and you can look at how that is. It's not that something in Obama's policy changed to be more progressive. It's really that I think after Bush, people were so fed up with the wars, they were so fed up with Republicans in general, that they wanted a kind of, you know, safe type candidate to appease people. And Mitt Romney is, I would say, as milquetoast and safe as you can possibly get for a Republican. Low energy Romney is like, I can totally see, and he's a billionaire himself. Like, you know, how safe can you get? so yeah, like I think that's why. Whereas, you know, then with Trump versus Hillary, the reason why I think Hillary she got more Wall Street funding, drastically got more funding overall than Trump, is because you're running against like a cartoon character. and there's a risk to that. Even though Trump is a billionaire, there's a little bit of a risk. Like, he's a really strange guy who's made very questionable investments in his life. Like, he could, like, you know, as the Simpsons predicted, like bankrupt the country or whatever. Like, he could just totally screw things up. So there was a risk. And like, ultimately what the upper classes want more than anything is just stability of the system that made them rich.
But so, and this is what I'm getting at, like, the Democrats are the business party, they're the capitalist party, and Republicans are a more older money, you know, in terms of the trope.
Well, they're both
conservative. Yeah, no, of course. What I mean is like the stereotype, and you'd imagine that while Bezos and Zuckerberg are like have ridiculous amounts of incoming wealth at the moment, the party that represents capitalism and business, big business, is this is what I meant in terms of framing it as a game. And like when you go back to like John Locke, and he's writing about the peasant farmers becoming capitalists. Like, he's writing it like, the way I read it was he was writing it he was excited, like there was a game afoot, you know. and
Mhm.
growth. Watching this happen, I mean, I'm sure it's what happens when people literally play computer games like Minecraft or whatever. And the little systems, the little ways things sort of take off on their own and develop and grow. Whereas sort of old established money, who, not all the aristocrats got their heads chopped off. Like who would have
Mhm.
sort of much
Well,
older
that
established wealth?
that's interesting. Having a kind of really bullshit democracy, and in the case I say with U.S. is not even actually democracy, and I say literally because the U.S. is a republic. It's not even a parliamentary democracy in the first place. It's very different, but it is like more easier to maintain power. And I mentioned that at the end of the video. It's like you have like a binary to choose from. It does prolong it as opposed to a centralized locus of power, which is easier to identify and easier to, get sick of. It's easier to prompt like a kind of resistance to an extent, And this is, I think Zizek said something interesting where he said, China, like a very authoritarian capitalist country, he said one thing about China is that people there aren't under the delusion that they're free, whereas people in America are, and that's really troubling because like America is not just like less free than people think; it's actually less free in terms of electorally than a lot of European democracies like France, Germany that have multi-party systems. Yeah, it is like the system of binary oppositions does kind of sort of maintain power, but short-term versus long-term interests. I consider the idea and the distinction between short-term and long-term interests of the capitalist class to be a very good segue into structural Marxism versus instrumental Marxism and the ostensible divide between the two. Based on the video that I did, which as we're speaking now hasn't been released yet because it's taking very long to render, but you saw the draft version, and in there I go into a bit of two slightly different ways of looking at things through a Marxist lens called structural Marxism and instrumental Marxism. Structural Marxism really pioneered by people like Nicolas Palanzas and Louis Althusser, and instrumentalist Marxism by people like Ralph Miliband in England, the parliamentary socialists. And what did you think about that? And what is your interpretation about that? And as to maybe how it's useful to explaining today's politics?
Yeah, I mean, I was only introduced to it through watching your video and what you had sent me, but I mean, it does sort of pertain to a lot of what we've already been talking about, really, doesn't it? Was he Marxist explicitly?
Palanzas or
No,
Miliband?
Miliband.
Miliband did consider himself a Marxist, but he called himself he probably wouldn't be considered a Marxist by like, very, very traditional Marxist. But
yeah, exactly.
Miliband
well, he did say that it was like a class struggle.
So yeah, no, he absolutely uses Marxism. It's just that his solution, he's just not, he's a Marxist, but not really a communist. He's a parliamentary socialist, which you could say that's practically in line with like a Corbynism.
Yeah, and I think in terms of everything that we've said to point it and the limitations I think we've attempted to describe, I think it fits in there, and this idea that the state can be used as an instrument, to sort of as a tool, an instrument, a tool to get your way.
Okay, so I think a basic rundown is that so I want to get into, I think I misportrayed Miliband a bit in there. Yeah. In because while he does, so the instrumentalist position is the idea that the state can be instrumented by the will of the working class. But he was not deluded either in thinking the state was a neutral factor that could just be controlled. And that being said, though, in the video, I kind of suggest that he more saw that the problem is that politicians were basically influenced by their bourgeois class position, which is true, and that they're sort of under control. But what he wasn't saying. This is the point I want to correct. He was not saying that these politicians are under control of the capitalists, which it was a very widely assumed thing among leftist circles. And still to today, you see a lot of people talk about the deep state, right? Both on the left and the right. And you see the notion of the establishment, which, it exists, but it's not as, what Miliband was trying to say is the state is not this omnipotent actor in which capital interests and state interests are always they're always the same and inseparable. That's not actually true. And he found this out by spending a lot of time directly in labor circles, because he tried, he was very active in parliamentary politics. His son, for those who don't know, Ted, wait, was his name? Ed Miliband. Yeah. Oh, your name. Yeah. Ed Miliband, who is vastly less radical than his father.
Yeah, absolutely.
He spent his whole career running away from his father's legacy. He's like a moderate liberal. But yeah, his son, was a candidate against David Cameron, I think in 2015.
Yeah.
But Ralph Miliband was spending a lot of time, and you notice that there's actually, a surprising disconnect between, and this is at the time, okay, this is different from now. I would say this is actually a little bit, the waters are a bit muddied now. But at the time, it's not like, the state was working directly on behalf of the capitalists. They're acting on behalf of the capitalist system, but they're not so aware of this. At the time, a lot of these politicians were just really doing what they actually honestly thought was best. And simply, the window of thought was very limited because a lot of these politicians come from bourgeois backgrounds, and they thus kind of subconsciously act in the interests of the bourgeoisie. And in his view, what this means is that, if you get more working class people in the state, you can transform it in favor of the working class.
Yeah.
I think
the hegemonic struggle. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, it's different, I would say, now, because then I would say there was actually a real disconnect between the public officials and the capitalists, but now it's not so clear. Now you actually, due to the campaign finance laws that are totally unregulated in the United States, you have, I think it was like Kamala Harris, Biden, they had like 68 billionaires backing them. It's absolutely insane. And you can see the direct outcome of elections, because I saw the list. There's an article I have in my sources in the description of the video. Even though I didn't mention it, I decided to put it there. But it was an article that just showed like the candidates that get the most from billionaires. And the most was Joe Biden. And in the first cycle of the Democratic elections was Kamala Harris to get the most billionaires. And what do you know? You get Kamala and Biden on the ticket.
Yep.
And yeah, so there is a direct influence. Like you see in Pete Buttigieg too, a lot of billionaire funding. And I think it was Elizabeth Warren who spent a lot of time in the Senate who kind of disclosed that in policymaking, the one thing whenever the senators and Congress were discussing a bill is whether the banks would approve of it. So in the United States, at least, now you can actually probably make the case that the state is directly controlled by the capitalist class to an extent that is more true. But at the time when Miliband and Palanzas were writing, it wasn't so clear. At the time, really, the state was more just arbitrating between the worker and the capitalist. They were doing so in the service of the capitalist system, but not in the service of capitalists per se. They're not we're dictating things behind the scenes. Yeah. No, these people just thought that moderate capitalism, you just need to keep things stable. And yeah, that's one thing. Miliband's point, which I don't think is all not valid. I think there's some criticisms we can get into, but it's not like a crazy idea in the sense that it's not like the state isn't such a simple one-dimensional instrument. It's really, the problem is just inflated with people with bourgeois interests, bourgeois ideology, and we can and shouldn't abandon, according to him at least, electoralism, and socialism can be achieved electorally and through a parliamentary system.
Yeah, and again, that's electoral and parliamentary politics would be very much part of that hegemonic strategy, which to point of sort of articulating the limits of, and I think those limits come up against, if I've got it right, the Polanyi's take on the state as being far more, and this brings us back to that historic, the historic example of the left and the right coming out of the capitalist class who were in control, because of course early parliaments consisted only of landowners. Only landowners could vote.
Yes,
and so as an institution, I mean, why did it even arise? You know?
Don't lords still aren't lords still a thing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. Yeah. The House of Lords.
Yeah, it's quite insane.
Yeah. Very.
But yeah, like to go further. So in terms of the difference with Polanyi and Miliband, is Polanyi was much more skeptical that the idea that the state could be so easily instrumentalized in favor of the working class. So I think, direct quote from his rebuttal to Miliband is that the relation between the bourgeois class and the state is an objective relation. This means that if the function of the state in a determinate social formation and the interests of the dominant class coincide, it is by reason of the system itself. The direct participation of members of the ruling class in the state apparatus is not the cause, but the effect. That's actually really interesting, because that does round counter to Miliband's, in the sense that Miliband sees it more as the cause, is the fact that the bourgeois interests are what infiltrate state. As
if the state existed, as if it was an actual tool, as if it was something that was picked up, and by the bourgeois and went, oh, look, this is what we're going to do with it, which is, of course, not the case, because it was developed by them for them.
Yeah, and that's also institutionally, because what I like about Polanyi's view, and it comes really building off Althusser's idea of oppressive and ideological state apparatuses, is that the state is not merely like the government, the executive, the parliament, or in the case of America, Congress and Senate and Supreme Court. He's looking at it more broadly. He sees educational institutions as part of the state. He sees, universities, the police as part of the state, as well as the church, interestingly.
Yeah.
All these things are part of the state. So I think if you go on the institutional level, this is something I didn't really get to go too in depth in the video, but a good example of like why the state is objectively capitalist, because that might be confusing to some people. And this, it's actually it's a staple in Marxist theory. I think Marx is pretty clear, at least from my interpretation, that the state is like a bourgeois relation. That's why he is anti-state. Like Marx is not a statist. You can be critical of the idea that the state will wither away, which I think is fair criticism to be. But Marx was like certainly very, like, he agreed to an extent with the anarchists that the state is like a bourgeois
they changed
function.
his mind, didn't they? In terms of, he went from wither to smash after 71.
After the French Revolution. Like he originally, when writing the Communist Manifesto, thought that the state could be a function to sort of transition to like communism. But he started. It's not so clear whether he just didn't think like you can, like, he wasn't agreeing with the anarchists, like you can go directly from capitalism to communism by just smashing the state. But yes, he didn't think the state was so necessary. It was an oppressive function.
Change it to smash the state, didn't he?
Yes, he wanted to smash the state. But what I mean is, like, it wasn't like the anarchists where he thought you can go directly to communism. He did think that there needs to be like a centralization in terms of, reorganizing the means of production.
Yeah. Just in terms of the actual existing bourgeois state being objectively bourgeois.
Yeah. And there is problems with just quick. Is this because like there is problems with the vagueness of Marx's ideas in this, because you have people with different interpretations, right? You got
they're all over the place as well.
You get people who say, well, Marx isn't a statist and not authoritarian, it's democracy. Whereas the idea between using the state as a transitionary tool is what the Leninists always use to justify having like a vanguard party.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you could say in some areas there's not exactly a big choice, but like it is can be problematic, as we've seen historically. Like they're like having that the state doesn't just wither away so easily.
No. Well, I don't see a sort of a context for it to have had the chance to do so, to be fair. I mean, whether it's like
I think the Vanguard Party there's a lot of failures, and it's not just the the killings and whatnot. It's really just the fact that what could be described as revisionists get in power very easily. Like it was very clear by Khrushchev that there wasn't a mission to go to communism. The state wasn't withering away, even though they hadn't moved to capitalism yet under Khrushchev. They stopped moving to communism, and they were spending more on Olympic Games and sports than they were on really, the needs of the people.
What was I going to say? The
Palanzas, yeah, you're
Palanzas.
In regards to structural Marxism and the state?
I'm just trying to remember the jump off point.
Oh, I think how we got to that is because Palanzas is much more skeptical than Miliband is about the idea of the state. Yeah. Okay, go on.
Yeah, so I think what is it? I think in terms of that, like Palanzas' take is far more sort of like if you think of like why is the church still a powerful institution? Why would he consider it still a powerful institution with regards to the state? And it's, I guess, that's that far more sort of dialectical, historical materialist perspective. Do you know where sort of where history is that constant struggle with itself in the material sense, where institutions are, I suppose, coming up against each other, and it's not. I suppose the view is underpinned by the idea that history isn't this sort of like you said earlier, the free marketplace of ideas. It isn't a competition between ideas, and the best idea wins, as of course we know that quite often the worst ideas win.
I did. The marketplace of ideas is a market, and then like products, the one with the best product doesn't always sell the most. It's the one with the best marketing.
PR. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So where we get to a point that that the feudal institution of the church is still sort of a central core part of the bourgeois state. That's that real material, the remnants of that process of where old institutions are combating with new ones, changing, adapting, the dialectic between sort of existing and emerging material things, institutions. I would think that's where, like, that's sort of where his ideas coming from, and like, so why he would come to consider the sort of the state in that wider perspective that includes institutions like the church, where I don't know, Miliband's is far more narrower, and that neutral tool.
Exactly, because I think it's a good example of this is, let's say Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders won, then what? It's not like it's not like they would overcome their hurdles. They can just it would be very hard to implement things, and that's because of the way the structure is set out. I mean, there's the obvious fact that simply you need more radical Democrats, more radical Labour Party members, in the executive and in the parliament. But there's also like the Supreme Court in the United States. The Supreme Court is sort of there really just to prevent anything from like people, in the United States are so attached to the Constitution despite not knowing what it is. Like the Constitution, I think, is fundamentally horrible. Like the Constitution is structured precisely in a way to make sure nothing changes. That's
that's the point. And, absolutely.
And they are actually upholding the Constitution. And the thing is, I think Bernie Sanders' policy team, even though I don't think they thought themselves that they were actually going to win, they were prepared in the sense that Bernie Sanders said he actually wanted to implement Medicare for all by putting it in the Bill of Rights, which is much radical than just trying to pass it through Congress, because
absolutely.
Then you make it so it's not removable. But of course, to do that, it would be the Supreme Court. which is an institution I fundamentally think should be abolished. It's not up for debate in a progressive sense, I think. Like, these institutions are some of the biggest hurdles. There's many others. Like, I think the media is an example. Like, okay, I think there's so many examples of democratically elected, I say socialism with air quotes because most of it's just social democracy, just, having so many limitations. From Venezuela, in the case of the media, is overarchingly, like, overwhelmingly against them.
Yeah, of course.
The Venezuelan media, and they're not oppressed. Like, Venezuela does not have an authoritarian government, contrary to, like, the propaganda. Like, they're more democratic than America is, but they can't do anything, because they have like all these institutional hurdles. That's another factor. But to be fair, it's hard to say Venezuela, because they would, if they did try to crack down on some of the, like, people trying to coup them, like Juan Guaido, I think like, they could dissolve the parliament, but the reason they don't is because the US would use that as an excuse with the UN to disinvade them. But Greece. I think Greece is a perfect example of why Polanyi's whole theory is so, like, correct. Okay, like, Greece. Okay, when they got elected, I think the party wanted a majority, but they had the IMF. Okay, they had the euro. That was an institutional hurdle, which is like a capitalist state, part of the capitalist state, and these they inherited the debts of the previous governments, and basically, like, by printing more money, any government can do that quite easily. But if you're tied to the euro, you can't. And as a result, they were kind of subject to the influence of the IMF, in which they had to do austerity and
bound by the material conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah, without a mandate to engage those material conditions. And I guess the sort of chat has been rebounded between this idea that we, bringing it back down to sort of people online arguing amongst themselves, we're presented with these battles of ideas, and that is the level of, or that's the effect of ideology, because we don't seem to be getting past and accepting those material conditions and what affects them, and we're concerned with, I mean, even the discussion of materialism on Twitter is mired in mired in an idealism discourse, because we're combating that ideology. We're combating the idea that as a total movement, including all the arguments, the question is, should we be doing this, doing A, or doing B? And as long as we're doing A, as long as we're just dealing in the sort of in idealism, right, we're getting nowhere near the sort of movement that, say, in Greece, or the same with Podemos in Spain, is sort of willing to push any power that is reconciled, if hypothetically it was even possible. But like you said, sort of Buffett and I don't know, the other guy, Dior, was it? Would stated that class war is
Ray Dalio.
Is the biggest threat. So if such a movement was ever to consolidate any sort of power, I was going to sign off saying, like, with the movement that would be necessary would be one that seeks to push a sort of a moment like Syriza or Podemos way past what anyone would find acceptable currently, towards engaging in material conditions rather than ideas.
Well, I guess that's a good segue to, like, a finalizing topic, like, to end with, is that, like, where the divisions of Miliband versus Polanyi, and I think it's interesting to clarify, because they're specifically Nikos Polanyi changed his positions on things as he got older. So at the time in the Miliband versus Polanyi debate, which spurred the ostensible structuralism versus instrumentalism divide, Polanyi was a little bit closer to a Leninist, not in the sense that he believed so much in a vanguard, but in the sense that he believed the state had to be smashed. And, he sort of implied, like, kind of, you need a revolution. that was like what he was implying. But later in his life, and he has a whole paper on it that he, I think Jacobin published it but he's been dead since then. But like,
Mm-hmm.
you can find it on Jacobin. But he has like a paper called "Towards a Democratic Socialism," and he paints like a vision of democratic socialism that is much more radical, frankly, than at least the way I see Miliband's parliamentary socialism.
Yeah.
Because Miliband never makes a mention of the hurdles between the state in implementing policies so much, although he probably does somewhere else. But I think the mere idea that you can even have a parliament in socialism is problematic. And that doesn't mean it has to be like a vanguard authoritarianism either. It's just that a parliamentary democracy is literally structured in a way to preserve capitalism. Yeah. It's literally proxy democracy. If you have democracy in which you elect people to do things on behalf of people, you will inadvertently have people in higher class positions influence those people more, regardless.
Well, not only that, it's establishing a secular political field that takes democracy from, like, sucks democracy from every other aspect of life into that field. Because once you're presented with, well, here's your democracy, that's where people come to believe that that's where the democracy ought to be. And it circumvents the practice of democracy in any other aspect of life where our materiality is played out, in the home, in relation to one another, in the workplace.
Yeah. Miliband, Palanzis also, in his idea of democratic socialism, even though it's also kind of vague, he was very much in favor of totally drastically changing institutions. A lot of institutions. It's hard to say because he's a Greek Marxist, so he's not really talking about the US that much. So it's hard to really actually apply his theories into different countries with different material conditions. But he doesn't mention really remaining the parliamentary system. So what I kind of infer from his vision of democratic socialism is a kind of, starting out a parliamentary democracy that eventually transitioned to a form of direct workers' democracy. And very much like what Rosa Luxemburg sort of envisioned in that, like, worker democracy in real life. Like, that's what democracy matters, really. It's like,
yeah, and that's what I meant. You're
over the means of production. That's what
that process is disassembling that secular field of politics and bringing politics back down to those places. Like, who the hell, in their normal life watches parliamentary discussions? Who the hell engages in politics in a day-to-day situation?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of writers.
It's really the idea of parliamentary socialism to me is, it's very naive, but I believe what really is the reason behind people kind of still believing in an idea of just parliamentary socialism is like the moralism that still plagues the left, is that they don't want to be seen as like, a authoritarian or whatever.
Yeah.
And like, okay, first of all, when the Nazis got elected democratically, they weren't like, let's just keep the socialists and the social democrats in power. Like, they're not deluded. Like, they knew that, like, to get what they wanted done, they need to remove obstacles. And in the case of, like, you do get into muddy territory here. That's the problem. Is like people, you want to seem like amoral or whatever. But do you think that if socialists were democratically elected, that the bourgeois class would not mobilize themselves to overthrow the government? They absolutely would, and they have. In the case of, I can't think of a better example than really Salvador Allende in Chile. Which he was like a democratic socialist. He wasn't like, social democrat. He was redistributing land. He was really talking about like a computer, like cybernetic centralized planning. Like, it was really radical. One of the best hopes for the left, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And it could have been, and it was still like he was a pro-democracy. He actually strongly disagreed with Stalinists and Khrushchev Russia and Mao's China even. But, he still got couped. and that's the thing. It's like the reality is, and this is, Marx was very well aware of this in his early writings, and he's clear about that, is that you need to remove the bourgeois class. And that doesn't mean necessarily kill them, but you need to remove the bourgeois class, right?
The class is a material entity.
Exactly. Like, you got to take the wealth. Like, it's just the truth. Like, if you let them be with all the resources, they're going to go somewhere else mobilize, they're gonna find a way to gain back power. So yes, there does need to be like a transitionary period that is, some might say it's not democratic, but I mean, the state already does things that are very undemocratic that are implemented democratically. Like, would you say
parliamentary politics?
People took away welfare.
Democracy.
People took away welfare. I mean, I think it's okay. Like, you can't say like Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it in the United States, and people aren't saying like that's authoritarianism. But like, if you talk about taking Jeff Bezos' wealth, nationalizing Amazon, all of a sudden that's against consent. Yeah. Well, I do think like I think some of these companies can be, I don't believe in the idea of breaking up the big banks and breaking up Amazon, like as if that's not going to prevent exploitation. Exploitation exists in all kind of businesses. It's that like I think they should be nationalized.
Hang on, well, breaking big business up like that is to revert back to the to that long run healthy. Yeah, exactly. That's capitalism at its best, really.
Yeah, it's just resetting the
competition,
the game, resetting the game, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty much what it is. Like, but yeah, that's interesting when it comes to the vision, is what they had. Yeah, okay, because I think there's many. It's hard to say in Latin America because really, no matter who, if they're even a social democrat, and I would consider Maduro more so that, because even though he's the Socialist Party, their policies actually aren't socialist whatsoever. The only main thing that really pissed off the United States was the nationalization of oil, which used to be occupied by American companies. They will face resistance from America no matter what. But what about a European parliamentary democracy that cannot so easily be, have a coup? Maybe a democratic transition is possible, but I think either way, you cannot just leave the parliament intact. Like, do you think you're gonna like you can't be serious and let's say the Socialist Party wins and just like, or whatever, or let's say that magically the Democratic Party became socialist, you just leave the Republicans like as if like.
Well, no, because so what you like to recontextualize it in terms of how you put it a few minutes ago, like in terms of taking the wealth, like Jeff Bezos has done a remarkable job in socializing the sort of the delivery system, the global postal system. The only difference between that being a communist business and a capitalist business is his ownership over that infrastructure.
I'm guessing you've read the People's Republic of Walmart.
Right? Oh no, I haven't actually.
Oh, okay, because that's
who wrote that?
Lee Phillips.
I'm sure Lenin wrote it.
And that's basically what
I'm sure Marx did too.
Well, it's interesting. Well, it's really interesting now because that's literally accurate. You're saying like Amazon, and that's what that really short book argues is that, demonstrates, not just argues, is that Amazon and Walmart actually use central planning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's organized top down. It's not like this inner competition, which some companies like Sears tried, competition between departments, and they went bankrupt. And Amazon and Walmart, they do things from the top down. They set their prices. It's not just like this ideological neoliberal market regulating idea. Like they quite literally use central planning. They manage everything very centralized, and I think there's no excuse that anyone could like not nationalize these companies. Like, it wouldn't change other than, like you said, it would be publicly owned as opposed to privately owned.
Yeah, that was the difference in terms of like having a sort of, if the far left did get into power, like keeping the likes of sort of people that represented Bezos's interests there would be rather useless.
Yeah, it kind of defeats the purpose of like a worker state, doesn't it?
But no, absolutely. What you described there, that the neoliberal frame, the way they frame capitalism in terms of competition. Yeah, so like there is a phase of capitalism that is competitive, but a competition implies a winner, and without a reset, that Keynesianism and or redistribution of social democracy, if that reset doesn't sort of, if wealth isn't taken through taxes and redistributed, and antitrust laws and all that sort of thing, breaking up big business, etc., if that isn't there in place, and it won't be, because a capitalist will always lobby against it because they're in competition and they need to expand, so they're only thinking of themselves, their own path forward. And of course, the more power they get, the more intense that competition gets, the more they're able to lobby for that deregulation. That will eventually, winners. Competition implies winners, and
I think that anyone who wants to understand capitalism should just play Monopoly.
Exactly.
That's literally capitalism. And the state is basically what presents. The state is basically just what prevents monopoly from ending in monopoly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, until you get neoliberalism, which tells us that that's what it's going to try to stop, but in actual fact,
even that though, it's still not like, it never will end like that with the state. Like if it, like in an ANCAP world, let's say anarcho-capitalist world, yeah, you probably would get like what you got in movies like Wall-E, with like one company owning everything, but
for sure. But like 100 years ago,
but yeah, the state does kind of give that stability, obviously, to this system by prolonging
it can when the material conditions allow.
But like you said, it is more in control by the capitalist class than it was in the time of these theorists writing about it.
I mean, 100 years ago, and it's sort of verging towards the same situation now, where say
Rockefeller.
Well, no, I was going to actually say 150 years ago, where competition was at its peak. 100 years ago, just before World War One, you've got that state of monopoly. You've got the winners. The winners are coming to the top, and sort of businesses, wealth is concentrating and business is narrowing, and competition starts. The form of competition changes, and you start getting before Germany knows what's going on, France, Russia, and England, or the UK or Britain or whatever the fuck, is sort of building rail lines and sea routes, and sort of subdividing, because their companies have gotten to the stage that they're not in competition with each other, like you sort of described with Amazon. They're in negotiation with each other, and they're subdividing the world, the colonization, the process of colonization. And Germany, the markets shrank before Germany gets a chance to sort of throw their dice down or throw their coins down or whatever. And what happens in that intense moment of competition is a conflict, enormous conflict.
There's actually a very interesting thing Palanzas said in the later part of his life, when he was seeing kind of the start of neoliberalism, and he made a point actually against like a dominant narrative that people were saying, and that you still hear today, is that neoliberalism represented the death of the nation state as corporations were kind of taking over. And I think a good example of this is that I remember I was like a couple of years ago at a class on internet policy, and there was a funny thing, like the professor was saying, is that Google and China are competing over Africa's internet infrastructure. And it's funny, like Google and China, like it's not US versus
Surely that's
China.
just a misanalysis of capital.
I'll get to that. Is that like the thing is that what Palanzas says is that, this isn't a death of the nation state. This is just the state actually just doing what it is supposed to do, and that is, maintain capital. But the difference is there isn't a labor force to prevent them to reconcile class interests, because there's nothing to reconcile. Like that's the difference. It's like when there was a threat of communism and the threat of militant labor movements, there was something for the state to reconcile. But when there is less leverage on the other side, they can, do that neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is authoritarianism. That's why I don't like it when people say, Trump, if Trump's a fascist, then Obama's a fascist, then Bill Clinton. It's like, well, no, you're then neoliberalism, capitalism is, since its very inception and implementation in industrial England, was always authoritarian. Capitalism is a statist authoritarian ideology by design, always.
Yeah.
And when it's, I guess you could say social democratic is obviously when there is that, like we were saying, labor militancy. Yeah, no, that's a difference. It's like fascism is just more a way capital reasserts power, and that's by appealing to the other, the explosion of the other, the scapegoating, reversion to tradition. It is different than neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was also authoritarian, but kind of presented itself as a kind of progressive in a sense, like it's going forward. It's globalism, blah blah blah.
I think, and bringing it back to the that early Parliament and the left wing capitalists, the bourgeois isn't necessarily the bourgeois isn't fascist as such, or the power base of fascism isn't bourgeois. So you've got a moment where the bourgeois, which literally means like a city dweller from medieval Europe, comes to the fore in society, in many instances, literally killing the aristocracy to take its place, and using the peasantry to operate its enterprises, and that's its situation. And for through its competition and without that state regulation you're talking about, will end in sort of empire and open conflict. But that's the society that they're pursuing historically.
Yes. Well, and that's what their ideas are. You're actually going to get into fascism. I want to hear that.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, like, fascism arises where 100 years ago, the grievances of that working base, sort of
in middle class. It's important to say middle class, because fascism historically is definitely more the middle class than it is the working class. But yeah, you're right in that. I've definitely
been saying working class, including sort of the middle. Like,
yeah. Because it is very much like an advanced capitalist thing. Like fascism, is different in other forms of capitalism in that it kind of pits the upper middle class and like. Against the working class and against like immigrants, exactly. Minorities,
But so what I'm getting at there is the rhetorical difference in agitating the support and the power base. Whereas so bringing that historic example to neoliberalism, under neoliberalism with your Bush, Obama, whoever, Biden, they're just happy to just keep it ticking along, and nobody wants the likes of Sanders, nobody wants class war. And that's why Trump is more acceptable. But Trump still is a qualitatively different entity to that sort of politics, to that sort of status quo, to that centralism. And while it's still sort of capitalism, it's rhetorically almost anti-capitalism.
To an extent, yeah. Well, I think Trump. See, what's really interesting is Trump was actually
anti-establishment.
Despite being very different from the status quo, Trump is actually the best thing to ever, I would argue, happen to neoliberalism. Because some people are saying that neoliberalism died. Well, what do you mean? Like, the modes of production under Trump haven't really changed. People somehow think that his trade policy is that different. It's not really. I mean, he didn't bring jobs back that were previously outsourced. He actually outsourced more jobs. And really, like, if anything, it's a continuation of like the Reagan type economic policy, Reagan-Clinton policy. Like, it's not a big change. And the main thing, and you see in Biden's policy is also harsh against China. Being harsh against China wasn't to be like, it's not anti-neoliberal per se. It's just, it's because simply Chinese capital is competing with American capital, and it's, the American interest versus, but Trump basically gave people a populist outlet to channel their dissent. Mm-hmm. And that was a way to actually, I would say, restore the neoliberal order, because that could very well have gone to, a Bernie Sanders, and part of it did. But in the case of Trump was a way to not only, channel anger away from capitalism to, the other. It also made a lot of liberals, and it's like the centrist traditional neoliberals, look a lot better in comparison to Trump. And that's the problem. Like, you see people, like Obama is like, everyone thinks Obama was so great. Look, comparing him to Trump, or some people, like, if Ellen, okay, the liberal communist, the liberal communist Ellen, she's like, like very cordial with George Bush and saying like how he was civil and like a good, it just shows you like how I don't think Trump represented there's no like, except I want to say there's no actual case in my opinion for the left voting for Trump. Like Trump wouldn't have made anything better for the left. Quite the contrary.
No, absolutely not. But I suppose I was just alluding to that sort of stability of society, which is entirely different to, and Trump, a sort of the fascism that he represents, it might have only been the sort of start, and it still may very well be the start of what's to come in terms of fascism.
Yeah, but that's true. Like, I really hope that the next nominee is not Tucker Carlson.
Oh God!
Because that could be a real threat. Because the things about Tucker Carlson is, I would say he's more fascist in his rhetoric, and people say, yeah, but he's more populist. Yeah, fascism is populist in its rhetoric, but it never is in practice. Like national socialist. Like
this is what I'm getting.
You see like left wingers falling for it. Like I don't mean like left wingers like knowledgeable Marxists, but like I see people on Twitter who watch people like Jimmy Dore, and they see like Tucker Carlson saying something about how we need to tax Jeff Bezos, and we need to like stop inequality, and they're like, Tucker Carlson's base, and it's like, Tucker Carlson's a millionaire, you think he's ever going to do that? Like he's literally paying lip service to be that populist right candidate. Hitler literally kind of ran on like wealth redistribution, but like obviously went into the Jews as being the bourgeois class.
So that's what I was getting at with the idea that it was anti-capitalist, it was anti-establishment, it was anti the liberal elite, and that's the difference. It's that rhetorical thing, because the outcome is the same. Well, I mean, to a point. With respect to actual anti-establishment and actual sort of change for people, it's the same, because it isn't oriented towards people, only rhetorically, and that's the sort of then coming away from the differences where one group just pursues a stable society where it's on top, and it's all beautiful and everyone's lovely like Ellen. The other side of it, what's the other side of it? The other side of it is
like the reactionaries, the fascists.
Well, the other side of it is... Are
you comparing like the liberal communists like Ellen and with who?
It wasn't in terms of society, but actual rhetoric. So rhetoric is the other side of it. And both the similarities are operating in terms of rhetoric. One is attempting to extend that beauty and civility and a lovely, stable society that everyone gets to be part of if they just work hard enough. And the other is revealing the limits of that promise and sort of extending a change, and that's incredibly seductive. But of course, I mean, you see this materiality doesn't mean any change.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you see this trend in most liberal democracies, not even just the United States. Is like I'm not sure. I don't know the exact conditions of every country, but like I can speak for like England and Canada. Is that, or Germany too? You could probably add a bit when it comes to Ireland, but. In Canada, I remember I talked to a lot of people who aren't that, like, they're not very political, but they're aware generally, and they're like, it always seems like we always get the liberals and conservatives, and it's about getting the conservatives out, then we get the liberals, and the liberals don't do anything, and then we get and I'm like, yeah, that's the system functioning as intended.
Absolutely.
Like that's exactly what, like, that's the system of binaries that's to maintain, like, there's one of the first Canadian socialists who was responsible for Canada giving us universal health care, and that is Tommy Douglas. He has a quote, I think it's excellent, where it's like, liberal democracy is choosing is like us mice choosing between black and white cats.
Yeah,
like we're both gonna get swallowed. So like that I think it's, I really think you can't have people might say, oh, the problem is just capitalism and we can have parliamentary socialism. But I think parliamentary democracy is precisely structured in a way for capitalism. It's not meant for socialism. Socialist democracy should be democratic at the roots, like where people actually live, where people work, and like the means of
dismantle
production.
that secular field of politics. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
I mean, it really is just looking sort of back through the history and what purpose does it serve, and then sort of imagining, well, do we need, does it benefit people materially if we continue that function? And I don't see why.
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, this one last thing I want to add actually comes to that discussion is the Japanese Communist Party, because I've been learning a bit about like the history of Japanese socialism / communism. It's kind of interesting.
Niche.
Yeah, and well, because I've traveled to Japan and stuff, so
cool.
It's like they're very conservative, but it's weird. They had like a active communist party that was actually the main opposition up until I think the late 60s or mid 70s.
Main opposition. Wow.
Yeah, and he got murdered, the leader of the Communist Party. But
that's what happens.
Yeah, but what is interesting is that no, they're still active. They're actually the Communist Party in Japan is actually more has more seats in the Japanese parliament than the Green Party in the U.S. Well, in the U.S. they don't really have a parliament. It's hard to get any seats in anything. But and then they actually also have more seats than the Green Party in Canada has. Like the Communist Party in Japan. It's small, but it's like there's still like a faction of Japanese people who still like, they haven't been hit by that Cold War propaganda. And what's interesting is that I actually looked at the manifesto of like the Japanese Communist Party, and they stick to a lot of Marxian concepts. And when I say that is that they're not like this parliamentary socialist. They actually make it very, very clear that the first thing they'll do in getting to power is actually to liquidate the parliament and start a transition into workers' democracy. And I find that really interesting because, like, you're really going to let the imperial reactionaries like come overthrow you? Like, obviously not. Like, it's smart. Like, I like how transparently aware they are.
Yeah,
because I think,
refreshing.
Look, I don't think you can delude the bourgeois class. Like, I think the bourgeois class knows that if socialists, I wish they were right about their suspicions, but you always see the bourgeois class accuse leftists of like, oh, once you get in power, you're gonna like ban rich people. And it's like, no, we should be like, yes, we shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We shouldn't be like, shying away, saying you just cap it, like, only the ultra billionaires. What do you mean? A billion is already like way too much for anyone to have. And I think we should like be transparent, because you saw people like Chris Matthews and the head of Comcast, MSNBC, like get totally frantic about Bernie Sanders possibly winning, and when it was in Nevada, and he said it's going to be like the streets in Cuba when Castro executed landlords, and that's not the case, because what Bernie's promoting is like super moderate, but like. I don't know about the murdering in the streets, but people should I think the left should be pretty clear that like, yeah, we want to you either got to, transfer the means of production or go to jail at least.
Yeah.
Like something like that. Like, like you can't just leave the conditions as the way they are, because they will reproduce capitalism inevitably. But also, but the Japanese party, they're clear about that. But what's interesting is they also reject like very authoritarian forms of already existing socialism. Like, for example, they not only denounce China, but that's not a surprise. China is not even capitalist. Okay, I'm not a pro-imperialist, by the way. Like, China's not even socialist. I wish the best for Chinese people. If they were turned out to be socialists, that'd be great. I hope for that, but the evidence is just not there. But the Japanese party also denounced the DPRK, like North Korea, which is not capitalist. It's certainly not a capitalist country, but it's certainly not an ideal form of socialism. It's like a monarchy type socialism, and very cultish too. Like, I think I like that about the Japanese party, is that they're not deluding themselves that they're going to hit this liberal parliamentary democracy, but at the same time, they're clear that we're trying to go very different from the type of socialism that was established in many agrarian developing nations.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Japan actually almost went Leninist in the 1920s, but one of the leading Japanese Marxist theorists I forget his name, but he thought that Japan wasn't ready for socialism. He's probably right, because a lot of the developing nations weren't really ready for socialism,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see that by the results. But
Well, that's the other side of the materialist.
materialists, yeah, like I think Marxists should definitely
It's
analyze
the other side of the
like
conversation.
Yeah,
We've been discussing like where capitalism has sort of run its course, and the contradictions are just proliferating, and they're being held together flimsily
very different
by
in different
ideology.
countries too.
Yeah. Oh no, of course. But the other side
like,
of the
that leader of the Japanese Communist Party in the 1920s got purged by the Leninist faction, which is just so funny, because it tells you everything about I know some very nice thought, smart Leninists, whatever, Maoists, but or Marxist Leninist Maoism, because that's a thing. But you see a tendency, you always, if you ever been on Communism 101, okay, on Reddit, which is dominated by Leninist / Stalinist apologists and Maoists, they always ban you whenever you disagree with them. And that just tells me everything about what they would do when they're in power.
Yeah, they're just playing out a bit of fun, aren't they? And if they were ever to, that's exactly the game they'll continue. That sort of niche cult. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I think the left should not it has to be dialectical. It has to go back to Marx's actual ideas. It can't you can't I don't think a lot of people, I notice their reaction is to the soft Bernie democratic socialism and the failure of Corbyn to get elected. They respond to that by kind of going tanky, but it doesn't have to be the other extreme. I don't mean to go centrist. It's not centrism, but what I mean is Marx himself. If you actually take Marx literally, Marx was very democratic,
absolutely
very for democracy. So I don't think that's something to be against. Just not the liberal form of capitalist parliamentary democracy.
Surely, and I don't know, I think I might have mentioned this in the chat over on my channel, but surely that sort of that fetish for the way communism stalled in the 20th century, as a horizon to work towards, surely that is the same as any other neoliberal identity politics. Just this is my niche, and this is what I want to do, and I'm just expressing my identity because I want to be edgy.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother problem, I think. I think that's really just I remember I posted a tweet, and some people thought I was crazy just because they know what I was saying, but I said most leftist infighting, and I was talking about leftist infighting today, not Second International,
the real deal.
Yeah, leftist fighting now, online left, is mostly all created by algorithms. And what I meant by that, it's not just because the algorithm tends to suggest you things that might be a bit contentious so that you are engaged, but it's also because algorithms cultivate identities, in the sense that a lot of people, they go down certain rabbit holes. There's not just a bread tube, left tube rabbit hole. There's an anarchist rabbit hole now. There's a Leninist rabbit hole. And some people come out with an identity. And
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you've got a field of chaos, your impulse is to sort of make yourself distinct through it. Do you know?
I think, and I think it's really un-Marxist and un-materialist to be sticking to a very specific doctrine of Marxism,
absolutely,
without considering the economic conditions. Because let's say it this way, I think it would be really stupid to be absolutely Maoist no matter what. Because Maoism, okay, you can make good arguments like some Maoist or Marxist-Leninist Maoists do. MLM to be short, that it's actually a very successful and applicable theory when it comes to third world developing countries, because of mass line is more easy to implement. Also, it's very ground up, and the conditions aren't suited for being democratically elected, whatnot. But I think it's ridiculous as
this
theory
is
for the first world.
What I meant, yeah, for sure.
Because as a theory for the first world, there's not even a peasantry. So that already, why would you take Mao Zedong thought? Yeah. There's not a peasantry. And two, I mean, Zizek had a funny
because it's
rebuttal.
edgy.
Yeah,
because
exactly. Cool. Yeah. That's another,
Sorry, go on.
For sure. Well, like
Zizek.
Zizek had a funny thing where he said, "I am not a Maoist." If you ask people, if you ask people, if you ask the peasantry or not
I don't
peasantry, if you
stop the
ask like
accent.
if you, yeah, I'm not gonna do the accent. But if you, if you
Sorry.
just ask people like what they, what the masses to teach you, which is like one of the ideas of Maoism, right? Like
Yeah.
ask the masses, tell you, they'll guide you, which I think is disingenuous because Maoism didn't really do that. Um, they just actually asked people to send letters to the government and notes as to the corrections, and they found the ones they disliked and purged them.
Of course.
So, like it's a distant. I really have a gripe with Maoism, but okay, if you ask people like today, like what they masses wanted, like, you'd probably get a lot of people, especially in Europe, who just like they'll like kick the immigrants out.
Yeah.
Like it does. Like there's no classes of like blank slates, like how Mao described the peasantry, like a blank slate, which is debatable even whether that was ever the case, but is certainly not the case now in developing countries where like a working class person, like everybody has access to so much information, and with that propaganda. So you can't just like, like you're not going to knock on doors in the ground up with these like radical organizations and just be like, um, tell the working class what they want. If you ask, like, there's a lot of ideological work to do. A lot of people just be like,
Yes,
who got
exactly.
the immigrants, man?
And I think that's an important distinction between, when we're making the early distinction between, or the underlying distinction between materialism and idealism, tackling ideologies is not just engaging in idealism.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And I think that relates back to, I'm guessing
it's
it relates
unlearning.
back to
It's unlearning. It's like
unlearning, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, a materialist approach isn't like, oh, we need to spread ideas and we're going to change society. You're
negating ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Like I would say, like, it's interesting. Okay, well, I think socialism at its core is actually common sense. Now it'd blow people's minds, like it blow people's minds, like who are ingrained into ideology. But socialism, when you minus all of the propaganda, all of the neologisms, socialism is simply just the idea that like certain things should be publicly owned, and people should be democratic, have a democratic workplace, and own their labor. It's pretty common sense. So like what socialism has to do is not so much like spread these ideas and innovative ideas. No, it's really just to undo all the capitalist ideas.
For sure.
And I mean, I
was going to say bring it back to the materialism, the material relations and all that to production of production. Sorry, there's a sort of a viral compulsion afoot, like the capitalist competition, and once you've gained access to the means of production, I mean ownership over and control over, you can't let it rest. You can't stop. You got to keep expanding it, and or else you're going to get subsumed by your competitor, and that's our preoccupation. And everything, particularly through parliamentary democracy, is geared towards sanctifying that process, and that's just a fucking illness. Like that's pathological. And I would think socialism is common sense. It's fixing that. It's sort of I don't know, like in a very simple stylized way, using the sort of the illustration of union for all, as putting aside unions issues, is using the collective bargaining power to not to necessarily bargain with the parliamentary system, not to bargain with capital, but to through solidarity to institute the resistance against that compulsion, and because that needs a critical mass for that compulsion to die.
Probably the most common sense way to like summarize like the difference between a liberal leftist and a communist is that liberal believes in like good leaders that serve the people, whereas communist believes in people overthrowing the leaders, not having leaders, and people serving the people. Like that, it's like you wouldn't have this problem in the first place if like you didn't have people extracting surplus from the people that do the work. Like that's
for sure, exactly
the main principle. I mean, I try to illustrate, like I'm actually after my next video. It'll be a while from now, but I've already kind of worked on it because I get little sprees.
Can't even render this one
creativity.
Yet, man.
Well, it's still rendering, yeah. But like, I mean, I've in the period like during this time, I've been working on other stuff.
Chunky pipeline.
I have a lot of different stuff in the works, but I eventually, this is after like the next 2 videos, we'll be doing a video on Tupac.
Oh yeah.
And how Tupac was a communist. He actually was a member of the Maryland Communist Party. And like as a way to explain communism in the most simplest way, socialism / communism, because Marx didn't make a difference, but nowadays people use socialism just to mean social democracy. But like I think like it can be explained in the most common sense, easy way through the lens of someone like Tupac. And he has interviews where like the guy has so much common sense. He expresses things in the most like common sense way as to, you know, like why capitalism is bad. And it's like, it's an interesting cultural window that I surprisingly haven't seen any videos on using Tupac and communism. So I'm going to do that. Probably people aren't aware, like people just, whatever. I don't want to get too much on it.
For a reason.
Yeah. Like, basically like the listeners of the pod, and the patrons will be hearing this first. I'll only be putting a segment of this probably on my channel because it's long, and this is more the full thing just for patrons. But yeah, like the listeners, viewers will have a lot to look forward to what I'm working on. And
I'll certainly look forward to Tupac.
Yeah, and I would go check out the new conversation if you want to learn some theory, specifically Laclau Moof, which is more the domain of what Ed is more knowledgeable of. I'm not so
currently
aware.
We're moving on.
Yeah, I mean neither of us are like experts or anything certainly like that. Not. But yeah, I would go check out their talks if you want to learn more about the stuff. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the podcast, and it was a very fun conversation.
It was. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So if you could share this with your friends who also enjoy this, that would be great. So thank you for listening. Peace out.
Peace out. Thank you for dropping by, and please do hit like, subscribe, or whatever other button of appreciation you can find. Hit all of them and go on hitting them. Thank you a million.